My name's Dion Broughton. I'm the Portfolio Manager for the Education and Training Suite of Qualifications. I'm joined today by David Knowles, who is the Senior Standards Verifier for Education and Training, and Elaine Jackson, who is the Senior Standards Verifier for the Learning and Development and Advice and Guidance Suite of Qualifications. Okay, so what we wanted to do today is I just briefly wanted to talk you through extensions and withdrawals of qualifications that's happening this year. Just have a look at the apprenticeship standards that we currently are delivering. David is going to take you through the adaptations that are in place currently for the Education and Training Suite of Qualifications. And Elaine's going to talk you through the adaptations that are currently in place for the Assessor and the Quality Assurance qualifications. Elaine is also going to talk you through the new qualification that we've just brought into the suite, which is the Endpoint Assessor qualifications, and we'll have a Q&A session. We do have the chat box function available to you, so if you think of any questions as you go through, please just put the questions in there and we'll pick them up and go through them as and when we can, and we'll also be available at the end for any questions. Okay, so the first thing that I wanted to talk you through was, and I'm sure you are all aware that the frameworks and the SASE frameworks closed in July of this year. Now, what we had on the SASE framework, we had the Learning and Development framework, and we had the Supporting Teaching and Learning in Schools SASE frameworks. So they've both now closed. They have been replaced with standards. So we've got the Learning and Development Practitioner that replaces the Learning and Development framework, and the Teaching Assistant standard at level 3 that replaced the suite of Supporting Teaching and Learning in Schools. Now, at this moment in time, we are not offering those standards. It may be something that we look at in the future, but at this current moment in time, we've decided to not offer endpoint assessment for those two apprenticeship standards. I just wanted to talk you through, so the suite of qualifications that came out of the SASE framework, we've got all of the Supporting Teaching and Learning in Schools suite and the Learning and Development qualification. What we've done, due to low numbers, we are withdrawing the Certificate in Learning and Development. So the last date for registration will be the 31st of December this year. Now, the suite of supporting teaching and learning in schools, what we've decided to do is to extend those for another 12 months just to see what take up there is outside of the apprenticeship standards. So they'll still be available for registrations for another 12 months, and we'll review that probably around June, July next year. Okay, so all of these qualifications have been extended to July 2021. Now, the reason why that is the Education and Training Foundation requested that we extend all of these qualifications to allow time for us and all other awarding organisations to get together and start looking at are there any changes that are required? Does anything need amending? Now, we may see that this is extended again, because we extended this before we found ourselves in the situation that we are with the pandemic. So we've not actually, as awarding organisations, had the opportunity to get together to start looking at these amendments, etc. Now, the situation that we've been in, we may find that particularly with the education and training, the discretions that we're having to put in place, or the new way of working, may encourage us to make changes to the qualifications around different ways of working and blended learning and teaching, over, sort of remote classes, etc. So we'll update as soon as we know what's happening with that. We'll make sure everybody's updated. Okay, so the standards that we are offering that sit within the education and childcare sector for standards are the Learning Mentor and Assessor Coach. So you will have access to the slides. So I've just put the links on there as to where the information is for these two apprenticeship standards. If you've got interest in delivering those, they'll be available there. Okay, I am going to hand you over to David, who is going to talk you through the adaptations for education and training qualifications.
Thanks, Dion. If you could move the slides on, please. Thank you. Okay, so this is guidance from the Education and Training Foundation, and it relates to the Level 5 Diploma in Education and Training. This was issued at the beginning of October, and this supersedes any previous guidance that was issued by the ETF. So first of all, centres should comply with the full guidance and 100 hours of teaching practice and 8 observations. Obviously, there was some relaxation of that earlier in terms of the number of hours and the number of observations, but what the ETF are saying now is that centres should comply with the full guidance, 100 hours and 8 observations. However, should the current situation the restricted access to face-to-face teaching opportunities persist, or there's a return to lockdown, the following relaxations or adaptations are permissible with the agreement of Pearson, i.e. the awarding body. If you could just move on, please, Dion. So the requirement for 100 hours teaching practice remains. However, the 100 hours may include one-to-one teaching up to a maximum of 15 hours. Also, the 100 hours may include live remote delivery, in other words, delivery where the tutor and learners are together, present online at the same time and engaged, and there is live interaction. And I think it's fairly safe to say that this is more likely to be the norm rather than the exception under present circumstances, certainly in the experience that I've had over the last few weeks in September. There are many colleges, training providers, schools delivering on an online remote basis. The second one there, the requirement for 8 observation remains. However, this may include observations of one-to-one sessions up to a maximum of 2. So 2 of the 8 observations can be in a situation where the teacher and the learner are operating on a one-to-one basis. And then secondly, this may include observations of live remote delivery. So you've got remote observations of remote delivery, if you like. So obviously, again, that's something that we're going to find very common under the present situation. Thanks, Dion. If you could move on, please. So the above deviations, well, on the previous slide, from normal established assessment practices, therefore, centres must obtain the agreement of Pearson, the awarding organisation. And I'll talk a little bit about that on a later slide. So any deviations from normal established assessment practice, agreement must be obtained from Pearson. Now, these conditions apply to diploma courses throughout the duration of academic year 2021, year ending the 31st of July, and may be subject to further review during this period. So obviously, if things change for the worse or the better, then obviously these conditions may change. They also apply to diploma courses which are ending before the 31st of December 2020. So that guidance applies particularly or specifically to the Level 5 diploma. If you could move on, please, Dion. So just moving on to the Level 4 certificate in education and training. So again, the requirement for 30 hours teaching practice remains, but this may include live remote delivery. i.e. delivery where the tutor and learners are simultaneously present, online, engaged, and there's live interaction. So in other words, it more or less replicates a standard face-to-face session. The ETF have not made any concessions there in relation to one-to-one teaching, so we assume therefore that one-to-one teaching won't apply within the assessment of the level 4 certificate. The requirement for 3 observations remains. However, again, this may include observations of live remote delivery. And again, these are deviations from normal established assessment practice, and approval needs to be gained from the awarding organisation. Thank you, Dion. If you could move on. And in relation to the Level 3 award in education and training, the guidance remains the same as it was before. In other words, the micro teach may be a live remote session, again with Pearson approval. So when the original guidance came out in April, this was already there. You can in fact observe the micro teach as a live remote session as long as it's been approved by Pearson. Okay, Dion, if you could move on. Okay, so this is what we have to do, or this is what centres have to do in order to gain that approval. So for any adapted assessment, based on what we've just seen on the previous slides, you need to email your allocated standards verifier with clear justifications for using online delivery at any of the 3 levels and live remote observations before proceeding with them. Now, obviously, the allocations, centre allocations, have now been out for probably 2 months. Your standards verifier should have been in touch with you anyway. So if you're planning any deviations or any deviations have already taken place or adaptations, then you need to just drop your standards verifier an email and just tell them what's happening. And I mean, obviously, under present circumstances, as I said before, this is more likely to be the norm than the exception. So your standards verifier is more than likely going to approve any adaptations. It's important, on the second bullet point there, that recordings of the live remote observations must be taken and securely stored and made available for IQA and EQA purposes. I've already had a couple of queries from my centres regarding the recordings, so I'll just reiterate there, recordings of live remote observations must be securely stored and made available. That's very important. That doesn't mean to say that all the teaching sessions have to be recorded, but certainly the live remote observations. And it's also important, finally, that all correspondence with the standards verifier is maintained for your records. And also, should there be any audit from Ofqual or from Pearson themselves, then obviously there is documentary evidence that approval has been gained from the standards verifier. Okay, I think that's everything, Dion. It is. So thank you very much. And as Dion mentioned before, there's an opportunity to ask questions at the end of this session. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. So it's Elaine Jackson here. I'll take you through the adaptations for the Assessor and Quality Assurance qualifications. Next slide, Dion, please. Thank you. So as David mentioned, all these changes are based on the Education and Training Foundations updated guidance on the 2nd of October. Obviously that supersedes anything that's been available beforehand. In keeping with the original intention of these qualifications, obviously face-to-face observations are preferable, but obviously we appreciate that's not entirely the norm these days. One option is obviously to delay assessment until a suitable opportunity for face-to-face observation becomes available. And I think we have to be realistic there about timescales, thinking about the learners and progression routes and job opportunities as a result. However, that shouldn't detract from the overall quality of what's been achieved in these qualifications. So as David said, with the E&T qualifications, remote observations are also permissible in the Assessor and Quality Assurance qualifications, but obviously subject to Pearson approval beforehand. In view of the local and national restrictions in place, then remote observations are more likely. And I think we've got to bear in mind that conditions during the learning programme should be as real and as close as possible to those likely to be experienced during their careers, either as an assessor or as a quality assurer. We've had some requests for remote observations already, and those conditions have in fact replicated those of face-to-face, so those have been approved. All these adaptations apply to any current learners or any that you're registering from now until any further guidance becomes available. Next slide, please, Dion. Thank you. So live observation is permitted. It's important to make sure that all the participants are present during the live observation. So, for example, the assessor of the qualification, the learner, and the student being assessed. So these relate to the assessor qualifications. First of all, I think it's important, again, to think about the different layers that are involved with assessing these assessor qualifications. Obviously, in other qualifications that are delivered in your centres, it's very much about the assessor and the learner in their sector. However, for us, there's that added layer. So it's us assessing our learners and then our learners assessing their candidates in whatever sector that may be. So it could be construction, it could be the fire service, it could be business administration, customer service, hairdressing. So we have a variety of learners that we're having to deal with in the assessment of these qualifications. And of course, those could relate to qualifications or indeed standards. So we always have to consider any overarching guidance that either the awarding organisations of the qualifications being assessed have implemented or imposed, or whether it's the employers themselves working on their own standards, or the national occupational standards, or indeed regulatory bodies providing advice and guidance at this time. So I think with all the learners, it's really important to understand what it is that any adaptations that have been imposed upon them in that sector before the observations and assessment takes place, to find out, is it going to be achievable at this time? So we've had instances where observations have been stopped, which might be okay because those can now be done remotely. So let's say, for example, they're organising a Teams observation or a Zoom observation, the learners in the room, the candidates in the room, and you can dial in as the assessors. So everyone's in the room at the same time, on the same day, observing that assessment. What we're finding is that sometimes it's needing additional professional discussion to top up that observation, because it doesn't always enable us to pick up everything in the assessment that we would normally be able to do face-to-face, for example. Obviously, it's important to think about the timescales, and perhaps, although we encourage the knowledge unit to be embedded in the competence-based unit, in some situations it might be more appropriate just to start with the knowledge unit and then consider the practical units thereafter. We've also had instances where learners have been registered to the full certificate with the 3 units, and because of severe restrictions, they've really not been able to gain Unit 2 now or in the future. So learners have been transferred to the 2-unit qualifications, doing Units 1 and 3. So I think you have to make those decisions as a centre based on what's realistic at this time for your learners. Next slide, please. The internal quality assurance qualifications, and just a reminder that there is a minimum of 1 assessed observation in this qualification. So again, face-to-face is always preferable, but where that's not possible in a realistic timescale, live remote observation is permissible. I think we've got a bit more of a variation with the IQA qualification on what that observation is likely to be. So I think we're not having many queries at all on the IQA qualification. That seems to be fairly straightforward in my experience over the last few weeks. Again, all the participants must be present during that live recording. It's still important to remember all those changes to do with the sector being quality assured, whether it's guidance given by the various awarding organisations of qualifications being quality assured, or it's an employer or regulatory body change. So it's important again to think about that. I think one thing that's really useful to think about is in the knowledge base unit for both the assessor, IQA, and probably the EQA qualification as well. You've got assessment criteria 1.4, which talks about all the regulations and requirements for the assessment or quality assurance of that particular qualification or standard. So it's actually a useful opportunity there to gain information from the learner about changes and adaptations in their sector at the time of assessment before they go on to the competence, because that enables you to get the full story to plan the assessment. Again, you can start with that knowledge base unit, and the guidance refers is applicable to all current learners and those registered in the future. In terms of the external qualification, we haven't got any specific direction from the ETF in regard to this qualification, but Pearson have adopted the same rationale as the IQA qualification. So again, there's a requirement for a minimum of 1 assessed observation. Live remote observation is permissible, and I think in a lot of cases EQA visits are remote. So screenshots, it could be dialing in on a Teams, sitting there in the background, observing that session. So again, anytime remote observation is required, you do need permission from Pearson, so I'll talk a bit more about that shortly. All participants must be present during the live recording. Again, that's just to replicate what we'd normally do face-to-face. As I mentioned before, it's about considering that overarching guidance for those qualifications or standards being quality assured. And as I said, it can be you can start with that knowledge unit. It also applies to existing learners and those yet to be registered. Next slide, please, Dion. In terms of the learning and development qualification, we've no specific reference again to this qualification by the Education and Training Foundation, but again Pearson will be adopting the same rationale as the Assessor and IQA qualifications. I think we've got to remember that in these qualifications we've also got units from the Assessor or Quality Assurance qualifications, so all those conditions remain in that particular qualification for those units. So live remote observation is again permissible, and making sure that all participants are present. And particularly for those Assessor IQA units, the conditions must replicate what we've just said about the Assessor and IQA qualifications. We've also got the use of witness testimony, making maximum use of witnesses in the work environment to get either a witness testimony in writing, or it could be via professional discussion, or even screen sharing, just to show other examples of performance over time. I think we are seeing an increasing use of witness testimony and professional discussion to back up some of these observations, or lack of live face-to-face observations. So that might become the norm as well. And who knows where this might take the assessor and quality assurance qualifications in the future. Next slide, please, Dion. Similarly for David's education and training qualifications, as he mentioned, so any adapted assessment, it's important to email your standards verifier with a clear justification about using live remote observation before you proceed with them. I think it's important to clarify those requirements, and you know your clients, and I think it could be for groups of learners. This is the type of scenario we're finding, which the SV will agree where possible. Obviously, we know local restrictions, national restrictions that are in place currently, so we're quite we understand what you're all going through, and do save all the correspondence with your SV for records, for the audit trail for Pearson, and also for Ofqual. Those observations that are recorded must be must be securely stored and made available for the IQA and also the EQA. Before we move on to talk about the endpoint assessment, I'll just give some experience that's happening over the last few weeks, and just some of the queries that have been coming up. It's usually been around the observations, and again, I think, you know, your standards verifier is there to help with any queries throughout the year, not just in terms of these adaptations. So do use your standards verifier as your first port of call. We've also had discussions around the use of work-based assessors. So, for example, where work environments have bubble arrangements and they're not allowing anyone else in around in those bubbles. We've seen this in the fire service, we've seen it in the rail industry, two examples there, and chemical plants also. And it's been very difficult for the assessor of the qualification to go in. So what we've recommended there is using qualified work-based assessors to undertake your observations for your organisation. So that's an option as well. What you've got to remember there is that that person undertaking the observation must meet the assessment strategy set down by LUK, LSIS, and now the Education and Training Foundation, in that they have to be assessor qualified. If it's an observation of the IQA, they need to be IQA and assessor qualified as well. Their CPD needs to be up to date. So in other words, all the requirements that you and your staff have to have, those work-based assessors have to have as well. So it's useful to have an audit trail confirming that. But that's actually an option where in certain circumstances the assessor's not able to do that observation, and because that's still a requirement of the qualification, we need to get around that in some way. So we've got lots of creative ideas coming in, which is lovely to see, because again, this might inform future qualifications. As Dion mentioned at the minute, all those qualifications are due for review at the end of July this year. Whether that's extended remains to be seen, or whether we get something in the meantime, but we'll keep you in the loop through the usual Pearson communications in that respect. So let's go on to talk about Pearson's new endpoint assessor qualifications. These are BTEC specialist qualifications. They're not MVQ or competence-based qualifications as we traditionally know them, and these were developed to really reflect demand and also to recognise the knowledge and skills required for endpoint assessment, because no matter how hard we try, sometimes the assessor qualification itself doesn't fit everyone's requirements. So Pearson have got two qualifications. The top one there is for people who are working as an endpoint assessor or have an opportunity to do that, and there is a knowledge-based unit and a competence-based unit. They follow a similar pattern really to the Assessor Qualifications as they are outlined at the minute. The second qualification is a knowledge unit only, and that's for people to know about endpoint assessment if people aren't already working as an endpoint assessor. Next slide, please. So the first unit is a knowledge-based unit, and there are 6 learning outcomes. The idea is to balance theory and practical knowledge to support learners in their independent endpoint assessor role. Learners should be encouraged to apply the evidence to their own circumstances, as we encourage with the assessor and IQA qualifications, so though it's always contextualised accordingly. One thing we have done with the assessment methodology is change this, or recommend a change to the traditional written Q&A, which we traditionally see in the assessor and IQA. It's not mandatory, but it is a recommended approach. And it just maximises application of knowledge. So, for example, one of the assessment methods is about preparing a guidance document. Again, I've seen that in the assessor and IQA qualifications where people produce a guidance booklet for new assessors or quality assurers, similar sort of thing here. There's also an element of presenting information to the assessor and an interview and discussion. So you can see it's very practically based and sort of helps learners to understand what their learners are going to have to do in the future as part of their endpoint assessment. Next slide, Dion, please. Unit 2 is the skills unit, and learners must be employed or acting in the role of an independent endpoint assessor to achieve this unit. So it's assessed in a real working environment where the evidence is naturally occurring and collected over time. There's a requirement for learners to assess a minimum of 2 students and present evidence across the whole endpoint assessment process, which includes the gateway. And you'll see in the knowledge base unit, all of the process actually comes together within that knowledge based unit to prepare the learners to do their provide practical evidence for unit 2. So evidence could include observation records, reflective accounts, witness testimony, and various products of the learner work. Obviously, we're mindful of confidentiality. We also appreciate that the endpoint assessments themselves are confidential because it's not like an assessment in work-based learning for assessor or quality assurance. These are tests, so the assessor will not be able to observe those, but there will be opportunity to observe other activities. Also for Unit 2, we're maintaining the requirement to have a countersigner. Obviously, that's to confirm the decisions are valid. Those people undertaking the countersigning must meet the vocational requirements of the relevant assessment plan as approved by the EPAO. So in those terms, we're not saying they have to have an assessor qual or specific qualifications. It's just that they meet the requirements of that relevant assessment plan. Next slide, please. The centre requirements. So the assessors and IQAs delivering these programmes in your centres must have the knowledge, understanding and competence in endpoint assessment. And that could be demonstrated, first of all, the expertise in endpoint assessment. So you could have experience as an independent endpoint assessor at the equivalent level or higher, but that must be within a 3-year period, and that's in keeping with all the requirements for endpoint assessment standards. People could have undertaken training through any endpoint assessment organisation, or they could have a recognised endpoint assessment qualification. There are a couple of AOs already undertaking those, different ones to Pearson, but we would accept that also as evidence of expertise in endpoint assessment. And in respect of vocational assessment, this could be experience of assessing and or internal quality assurance. Again, that's within a 3-year period. And also you could have a qualification in teaching or assessing or IQA. So again, this is where it differs from the assessor and IQA qualifications, because it is actually a different model entirely in endpoint assessment. Here's a couple of links to the latest guidance. Dion, yeah, thank you. And you'll see that's the guidance from Pearson relating to the guidance for the education and training qualification. It also includes the assessor and quality assurance suite, and there's also a link to all the adaptations for this year in other areas as well. I think we'll also make sure we've got a link to the endpoint assessment qualifications, so you've got access to those, and you can do the centre approval request in the normal manner. So that's the end of the presentation. We'll take some questions. We've actually just got one here. Can I do the EPA qualification if currently using another EPAO for the level 5 LST apprenticeship? You can. Yes, I think the answer to that one is yes, if I'm understanding that correctly there. You can apply to run the endpoint assessment qualifications, but the staff you use to do those must meet those sector requirements that I've just outlined on the previous slide there. So learners could be in any sector. That's why we've got the countersigners to make sure that those assessment decisions are valid. So does anyone have any other questions? You can bob those in the chat box, and David and I will take those questions. David, is there anything you want to add just while we're waiting for those to come in?
No, not really, other than just emphasise the need to contact the SVs if there are any queries in relation to the adaptations or anything to do with the qualifications. That's absolutely fine. So just seeing another question. Oh.
So this one's probably a question, Dion, for you. How will Pearson combine the new STSL standards with their own course content and assessment?
So the supporting teaching and learning in schools, we haven't mapped that qualification to the apprenticeship standard, which is why we are not going to offer the teaching assistant qualification. I think if I'm understanding that right. Sorry, say that again, Elaine.
Yeah, so the question is, how will Pearson combine the new STLS, isn't it, standards with their own course content and assessment?
Yeah, sorry, we've not, because within the standard there isn't a mandatory requirement for a qualification, so we haven't done that.
Okay, there's a question in there. If an education training candidate has collected evidence during the summer months before the current guidance was issued, must the portfolio now be updated to meet current requirements? I think the answer to that has to be yes, because obviously the current guidance supersedes the previous guidance. Adrian, I mean, if you want to drop me an email about that or discuss it further, we can do after this webinar. If you want to give me a bit more detail on that. Thank you.
I've just got a question just asking to repeat that. We'll be making the recording available to you, just conscious of time. We'll make the recording available to you and you can hear the answer again.
And just to say, my email address is on the slide. So if anybody does have any questions that they want to forward to me also, then please do so.
Any other questions? Just pop that in the chat box. Don't think there's any more questions coming in, Dion. Okay.
Well, what I shall do then is I shall end the recording. But thank you everybody for attending and taking time out of your busy day. It's much appreciated. And say if you do have any questions, please just give us a shout and we will see what we can do. We will collate all of the questions from this session and from the session that we did last week and make sure that we update the FAQs on the website and that you've all got access to that.